Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Sustainability Spotlights. I'm your host, Lavanya, and today we are diving into the intersection of technology, sustainability, and business strategy in the realm of sustainable products. Joining me today is Kimberly, who is a sustainability leader. Welcome, Kimberly. It is amazing to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to speak with you.
So, before we get into the nitty gritty, could you share insights into your background and what initially sparked your interest in the field of sustainability?
Definitely. So, I started my career as a scientist. I studied ecology, and I spent a few years actually studying what's happening on the ground. Afterwards, I worked for the US regulator. I still was in the sustainability space, working a lot on environmental impact assessments, bringing in policies that would help protect the environment. And afterwards, I realized that there was this missing piece of how businesses work with sustainability. There weren't very many people who understood the science behind it, what was happening in the policy realm, and understood how financing and business strategy works. So I went to business school. In the past 5 years, I've really focused on business strategy, still staying within the sustainability ecosystem.
Perfect. So we have someone who is today who is going to be talking and helping us realize on how product sustainability or sustainability in general can help to define the business strategy as well. And it's sustainability is not just a means anymore; it is the way of doing business. So I'm pretty excited about our conversation today, Kimberly. So you over the course of your career, when you started off, like you said, that there was not much being talked about sustainability and business together. How have you, could you let us know what has the evolution looked like? And are there any notable trends that have caught your attention previously? And what is it looking like and going? What are the trends currently that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, but sustainability has really exploded in the past few years in relevance and in interest from businesses. And what we see is that it's shifted from really a purely compliance focused market in the early days, so complying with the National Environmental Policy Act in the US, doing these environmental impact assessments, but not necessarily viewing it as more than a box checking exercise, into becoming really a strategic backbone for a lot of businesses. Now we're seeing more businesses kind of see that, while sustainability might actually be a differentiating factor, in particular for employee recruitment and employee retention. That's really where a lot of businesses are seeing value, which is special. And it's becoming so much more important, as it should. It's becoming a lot more urgent as well. And the second trend that comes with that is that now that there's more business interest, there's also a lot more funding in the environment. And we see that in a few ways from venture capitals now starting to back up. There's a lot more startups now than there necessarily used to be. This used to be really an ancillary service from larger, especially engineering firms. Now you see a lot of startups that are pure play sustainability focused. They're often backed by venture capital. And there's even a lot of private equity movement in the space. So it's really something that was a bit of an afterthought to becoming a genuine business discipline.
Right. And what are you seeing is, the up and coming trend currently, which we're just starting to ride the wave.
There's a lot going on.
Mhm.
I think carbon accounting we've been talking about for quite a long time. There's the emission trading scheme in the EU. California also requires carbon accounting. I think that that part of the industry is reaching maturity, whereas other parts of the industry, particularly biodiversity, which is one of the things I focus on in my current role quite a bit, biodiversity is a lot less tangible than carbon accounting. It's a bit more like an art form now. Most of us can look at a biodiverse ecosystem and we can tell, yes, this is a valuable biodiverse, or no, right, this is a lower quality ecosystem like a parking lot, where there's just not a lot of plant or animal life. But actually quantifying it in a way that connects with businesses and accountants and strategy, I think that's still an area that's really rapidly developing.
That's interesting. And, in that vein, you spoke about finance and strategy and communications and business. So, how do you see has collaboration happened across stakeholders in a company? And again, how is it happening today? And where do you think, or what approaches and tools could practitioners take to enhance this and build out the communication between themselves and more business facing teams?
Yeah, so it really helps to have translators. That was the core reason I went to business school in the first place, was because I could speak science language, I could speak policy language, but I could not speak finance or business language. So having those people who cross disciplines is super important because every discipline it attracts a different persona. It attracts different people with different motives, different drivers. There's even different incentive structures within different ecosystems. So one of the examples I like to use is the difference between scientists who are often developing LCA data, and accountants realistically are often the ones using LCA data to generate environmental reporting reports for their investors and their stakeholders. And those two people are quite different. They're both detail oriented, but a scientist is really incentivized to find the edge cases because scientists were judged on how many publications you have, how novel your findings are. Is it really pushing the edge of technology? Whereas an accountant is looking a lot more for the median. They want something that's stable, it's reliable, and it's never going to change. And that sometimes leads to a bit of friction between ecosystems, and having people who understand both helps immensely. The second skill set that if you're right, maybe you're not a translator, maybe you don't have the background in both disciplines, is just coming in with an open mind and curiosity. There's the consensus building toolkit, lots of training from, I think, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration back in the States, NOAA. They have a coastal training program with a free online materials about how to build consensus, how to work with stakeholders. And a lot of it just comes down to asking why, pushing below to really understand each other and being open minded and just understanding and respecting that there is a difference and not making assumptions.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful, Kimberly. And speak you spoke of scientists and accountants, but both within the sustainability realm. What when we go out of the sustainability realm and say talking to the finance team or talking to the marketing and the sales team? So how does that collaboration work, and what are some pointers that you can give professionals to help in that?
Yeah, so it's going to sound the same, but it's all about speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do consensus building, it's important to really listen to the other side and understand their needs and their drivers and their interests, even the ones that aren't obviously about sustainability. So, a marketing team, they're all about growth, they're all about generating interest, brand reputation, the brand strength. So, when you cater your message and you cater how you see the win wins to address their underlying needs, it builds trust, it helps them feel heard. So, they're more likely to agree and be a constructive part of the project. But it also means that you're actually serving a need. So, it's creating a lot of tangible value. The same goes for strategy. But yeah, it really helps. The best negotiators are actually the ones who speak the least because they're listening a lot more and then they're learning more about their negotiation partner. And the same kind of goes when you're stretching across.
Right. So a pro tip would be that in meetings one should be a good listener and taking a lot of frantically taking notes so that understand a lot about the other team members and what they care about, what their KPIs are, and then you can collaborate and add on to their KPIs so that ultimately it impacts how sustainable the business is then.
Yeah, and maybe not just being silent and taking notes because that's a bit of a, yeah, that's not necessarily the message, but just asking why and asking almost coaching questions where asking why, being open, asking why is always okay to push to a deeper level from the position. Yeah, we're too busy. We don't want anything new. We don't see how this creates value
Mhm.
to actually, we're really stressed out because there's this other issue of uncontrolled risk. Right. Just asking why and really pushing and saying, well, what are your risks? Where do they come from? Right. And then so sort of leading them down the same path. If you're doing it well, the people that you're working with will think that the idea was their own and own it as it really will help it be a lot more effective.
Right. So, in one of my very recent conversations, Kimberly, I was talking to someone who said that generally sustainability teams are looked at as cost centers rather than as, P&L teams or P&L centers. And would love to get your thought on this is that how do professionals build out their teams, especially talking of sustainability leaders? How do you present your team as somebody who's adding, a P&L value to the company and not just a cost center?
Yeah, it's tough. And it's also hard because sometimes we think of cost centers as a bad thing, but often in a company structure, it's because it applies to multiple divisions or multiple geographies or departments. So, like, nobody argues that marketing creates value,
Mhm.
but they're also viewed as a cost center without a P&L necessarily. So, just kind of giving ourselves that grace to recognize that we wouldn't exist in the company unless it created value. And then as you're, building the backing for new initiatives, like, if there's a new sustainability project or a new strategy, like any other project that's core to the business, just go back to the business case fundamentals. Does it increase revenues? Does it decrease costs? Does it decrease risk? And I think risk is the one that we often forget about, but it is quite important. And sustainability fundamentally does decrease risk. And you can use the insurance industry as a bit of your friend with articulating the value that risk mitigation brings. That's exactly why the whole insurance industry exists. And they're also some of the biggest proponents for climate change mitigation as well. But just kind of, give yourself that space to know it does have value
Mhm.
and then just put it in the terms that a business person or a strategy might understand.
Right, right. So then, considering, just because you mentioned risk, Kimberly, so considering just the dynamic nature of sustainability, right? So how do we measure the longer term impact of sustainability strategies, particularly in terms of influencing business practices? And of course policies within a business, but a long term, how do you look at or how do you influence a longer term strategy?
Yeah, so it's two different questions. The first one's about how do you measure the impact, and the second one is about influencing in the longer
Hmm.
term. So I'll start with the first one about how do you measure it. So it's a sticky or a wicked problem, and but there's lots of other ones, right? Because strategy, it's also pretty difficult to quantify. Like, how do you decide that a new market is worth going after?
Hmm.
Nobody knows how big it is. Nobody knows the market dynamics, but you still have to make a choice. Do I go in for it? Do I invest? Do I not invest? And that's something really pulled from the consultant toolkit. So when I'm thinking about wicked problems, I think of them the same way I would have when I was a management consultant, which is I might not get a clear single number answer, which as a scientist or an accountant would love, but I will get a direction.
Hmm.
Um, and I'll be 80% sure about that direction, and that's really the best you can hope for. So I'll use the example of the Clean Water Act in the States. Um, and it was initiated because the water quality in the US was really bad. There was a lot of industry. They were just dumping it in the rivers to the point where the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire. Not great. And I would generally combine two quantitative approaches, top down, so really looking industry level, very aggregate, very right, very gross level. And then I would look at a bottom up metric of taking a lot of really small points of data, putting them together.
Hmm.
And I would validate it with expert opinion and something more qualitative. So for the Clean Water Act, right, your bottom up data is all the stream monitoring data. Maybe you don't have that much from before it, but there is some. You can also combine it with like disease data from the coliform bacteria, cholera, whatever. But the data exists. It's not complete. It's not necessarily good, but it gives you a gut feeling. And then the top down data might be something like the number of major catastrophes that reach the news, like Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And if you validate that with expert opinion of people who were around then and saw it over their careers, you kind of get the feeling that, hey, this act was effective, right? We have far more fishable, swimmable waters now. We probably have to spend less on freshwater, treatment for drinking. So, it's fuzzy, but there's a lot that's fuzzy and we just don't know, and you have to just make the best you can do.
Right. So this was almost eye opening, Kimberly, that because every time that you talk of measurable sustainability impacts, and given that sustainability teams have already always gotten a flag that how can we measure this, and how only it's not just a spectrum of good and bad, but it's definitely an eye opener that we should take a step back and kind of think as of the right direction rather than having the exact right number to begin working on something, so that we get somewhere, and then of course sky's the limit from there. uh,
Exactly.
yeah. So, Kimberly, as we conclude, I would love to ask you to share some tips for upcoming professionals who are starting to work in the field, and how they can make a successful career out of this. And what do you think going forward will help them keep up to the coming upcoming trends in the sector?
Oh, I think it just froze. But are you back
I
now?
am back. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
No, so I think you just asked the tips for the upcoming professionals.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the main tips I would have is don't lock yourself into a single discipline. Translators between disciplines, they always have value. So really, give yourself that space to explore, give yourself the space to be curious and to extend beyond what's necessarily obvious. Innovation really happens at the juncture between different industries. So build out. You should be deep in one thing, but broad across as much as you can. And the second is to focus really on the people side as well. So all projects and a lot of the problems that projects have or implementation, they're always people problems and they're always people solutions. So building up your soft skills like the consensus building toolkit, really learning how to be a good listener, ask the right questions, focus on the win-wins and building relationships and trust in any career will always help, but I think especially in sustainability where it is a very values driven change and it's a very values driven industry. So just having that, that sense of shared values and really building trust is super important in our industry.
Right. Thanks a lot for those tips, Kimberly. I'm sure that these will help a lot of the people listening on as they advance in their careers. So thank you, Kimberly, for sharing your expertise with us today. It's clear that the intersection of sustainability and business strategy is paving the way for a more sustainable future. And as we conclude, I want to encourage our listeners to stay informed about sustainability trends and consider implementing relevant strategies in their businesses. Thank you for joining us on the Sustainability Spotlights. Until next time, stay green.
Yeah, thank you.